Hi, you're welcome back now to this aspect of integrity, building a unique value-oriented personal identity. Now we're going to talk about identity integrity. As I've earlier mentioned, success identity has a major role to play with self-identity or personal identity. And when you talk of success identity, you can't really talk of sustainable success without talking about integrity. And that's why identity integrity has a major role to play when building a unique value-oriented personal identity. And it's always important to restate the fact that personal integrity is more of a function of intrinsic identity. That is, if you want to build a personal integrity, it is important to build the foundations of your identity based on intrinsic identities. That is, you want to build identity on intrinsic identities, sort of, having the foundations of your identity built from internal world to the external world. And when it comes to intrinsic identity, there are so many things, there are things you need to put into considerations. Because for you to be able to have a personal integrity, not only are you building with intrinsic identity as a foundation, but you are also taking into cognizance the importance of building based on intrinsic identity. When you talk of intrinsic identity, you talk of features of intrinsic identity. What actually makes an intrinsic identity contributes to the personal integrity. And that's where congruence comes in. Those who actually build the foundations of their identity on intrinsic identity, they have this congruence. That is, their internal world is actually in sync with their external world. That is, what they have as their unique values internally is what they actually project outside as well. And unlike those who build on external identity or on extrinsic identity, in such a way that what they claim to be isn't what they project outside. So by default, they are living from external into the inner world. But now, since we're trying to build a unique value-oriented personal identity, we want to build identity tailored towards personal integrity. Then we should be able to build take into consideration the importance of congruence, which as well as the features of intrinsic identity. They have this internal identity built, they have their identity built from internal world. They have the identity which they want to live by, which they want to be known for, which they want to be remembered for. And thus begin to live from internal world to the external world, and thus contributing values to their identity in every areas of life. And thus they will be able to sustain success over a long period of time. And one thing about building based on intrinsic identity is the controls which it gives. It gives you the opportunity to control your internal world, to be able to understand your feelings, understand your emotions, and utilize those things to your own advantage. But in instances where one couldn't control his or herself from the internal world, allows those things from the external world, those external determinants, to influence one's aspect of life generally, then you realize personal integrity would be lacking or would be considered to be deficient in such one's identity. So it is important to see how best you could take into cognizance the importance of building based on personal integrity. It gives you the opportunities to examine yourself, to have the self-awareness, and as well to be able to summon yourself when the need calls for it. That's where I mentioned self-confrontation earlier. Someone who's building on intrinsic identity will be able to say, hey, look, T, this is not who you are. I mean, such person could reflect internally and say, oh, this is not who I am. This is not the identity I want to build for myself. And he will take the next steps towards making adjustments tailored towards building his or her desired identity. Unlike someone who is building based on extrinsic identity, the person wouldn't care, even when the person is doing what is bad, when the person is doing what is good, he wouldn't be able to summon his or herself and call his or herself to account for things which he knows is actually doing wrong. And he would not be able to as well commend his or herself when he's doing something that is right. Because in major instances there is no internal checkmate, that is the foundations for which his or identity is being built on, right away from the internal wall. So you want to see how best to live in connection with congruence and as well have controls over yourself, and I think personal management has a major role to play in these instances. And to those who actually build their identity on intrinsic identity, not only do they checkmate themselves when they're doing something that is wrong, or when they're doing something that is good, not only do they commend themselves. When they're doing something that is wrong, they're like, oh, this thing is bad, this is not who I am. And they as well take a step to examine themselves and make necessary steps towards correcting things. And as soon as they do that, they even go ahead and commend themselves and say, no, look, I think I deserve an ice cream for living in congruence with myself and taking a bold step to be able to serve someone, to self-confront myself and tell myself, oh, look, team, what you're doing is bad. Oh, team, what you're doing is good. I actually commit it. So congruence has a major role to play. Control as well has a major role to play when it comes to building personal integrity. And there's no solid foundations for building personal integrity other than that of intrinsic identity foundations. Consciousness as well has a major role to play. And when you talk of consciousness as well, self-awareness has a major role to play. One being able to examine his or herself at every instance in time in relation to things that actually needed modifications in his or her life, and as well see how best he keeps making amendments or keeps doing the needful towards attaining his desires in many areas of life. And knowing full well that whatever it is he's doing, he's living in congruence with his identity. He's actually not living to the satisfactions of those who are outside, or living based on external validations without having his internal, without having his internal or intrinsic identity in place. Like, as I earlier on mentioned, when one is actually building from, when there is lack of personal integrity, you realize that not only what the person is doing, either wrong or bad, there is nothing to check with it internally. And that's where the problem often comes from. That's why in most instances, even when some people are doing what is bad, they don't view it as bad. Because in the real sense, they don't have an identity to checkmate it. They don't have an identity to checkmate if these things I'm doing is bad or wrong. They just do it based on the fact that, okay, this is something acceptable by the society. And thus they begin to engage in it. Only to realize over the long period of time that those things they've actually been doing have not been contributing to their values positively, or have not been projecting them towards their desired success. So that's why it is important when you talk of personal integrity. First, you should have these the internal world. You should build the identity right away from the internal part. That is, these are things that I want to associate myself with, and as such begins to build in relation to it. Thus, whatever it is that is coming from the external would always be shared from the internal identity which one has actually built. And consciousness as well has a major role to play when it comes to capabilities as well as capability as well as one's ability generally when it comes to attaining some certain goals, attaining some certain things. There are some people, ordinarily, even if there are goals they know they wouldn't be able to achieve in the next 20 years, they will tell you they can achieve it within 1 day. But to someone who is living based on intrinsic identity, will be able to examine his or herself and like, okay, honestly, I can't do this thing within 1 day. This could take me 10 years, or it could take me 2 years, or it could take me 1 year. So that's where consciousness comes in, and that's where integrity comes in. I think in my other course on developing principle-oriented paradigm, there's more of broader explanations in relation to that as well. So no doubt about the fact that intrinsic identity plays a major role in building a personal integrity. And another thing you want to pay attention to when building your unique value-oriented personal identity is your life purpose. I've come to realize the fact that either young or old, every one of us in this space of the universe has a major role to play. Jehovah God, who created every human, created each and every one of us with a purpose. And it's left for each and every one of us to be able to do this internal exercise and find out what that purpose is and as well leverage on it. And so when it comes to harnessing your life purpose, no doubt about the fact that you need a unique value-oriented personal identity. Without value-oriented personal identity, one's life purpose in one way or the other might be sabotaged. That is, if one has, actually discovered his life purpose, but those life purposes are not in sync with value-oriented personal identity, you realize that in one way or the other, such one might not be able to sustain success associated with this purpose. Take, for instance, the examples which I gave earlier on. Someone who takes delight in wine. No matter what his purpose is, I know God doesn't create anyone to lie. That, your main purpose in life is to go ahead and lie. No. But in situations whereby the person subjects his identity to randomness and as well doesn't see anything bad because there is no internal identity built, and thus he just subjects his personal identity to that of the external world. And now, in his careers, or in whatever it is he's doing, he begins to lie. You realize that those things will in one way or the other sabotage whatever success which he has accomplished in relation to his life purpose, and thus in one way or the other creating his life purpose. So that's why it is always important at every instance of time to examine yourself and what's the point right here in not building a value-oriented personal identity? What's the point subjecting one's identity to randomness? So it is important to see how best, not only in examining yourself to determine your life purpose, but you as well want to build a value-oriented personal identity to be able to sustain any form of success that comes along with your life purpose. And when it comes to life purpose, in order for one to be able to determine one's life purpose, one needs a little bit of self-awareness. You want to be able to examine yourself in details and have something more like self-awareness, and as such, be able to think through and say, this is actually my life purpose. In major instances, we often don't identify our life purpose because we don't take time to examine who we are. We don't take time to examine the gift God has actually given to each and every one of us and see how best we can leverage on it. And that's why I would as well in major instances recognize or encourage the building of unique identity. Because when you build a unique value-oriented personal identity, you would always have these inclinations tailored towards discovering who you are in depth, and thus you'll be able to leverage on your purpose. Also, imagination has a major role to play. You want to as well imagine yourself in relation to your life purpose. That is, you want to imagine you living in synchronization with your life purpose. And when you begin to imagine it, you want to imagine it in relation to unique values, that is, values-oriented personal identity, which would only sustain your life purpose over a long period of time. And as well, you also talk of conscience. Conscience has a major role to play when it comes to building a unique, value-oriented personal identity. And the saddest thing is, in major instances, some of us often neglect the role of conscience in our lives. We often don't take time to examine our conscience, or perhaps we don't take time to train our conscience to be able to distinguish between what is right and as well what is wrong. And in instances where we did not take into consideration the role of conscience, then one way or the other we not only live an incongruent life, but as well we subject our personal identity to that of randomness, and others we wouldn't be living based on personal integrity. This is how I live. This is red, and this is blue. And now, I will bring another color. This is red. We should be able to train our conscience to say, okay, this is red. Because it's obvious this is red. And we should be able to see this is blue. Because in the real sense, this is blue. But in a situation where we say, okay, which is obvious, this is blue, or we say, no, this is red. And this is red, but we say, no, this is blue. Then obviously something is actually wrong somewhere. It's boiled down to the conscience. So we should be able to see, to train our conscience, to be able to distinguish between what is bad and what is right. And to be able to call simply a spade a spade. And okay, this is blue, this is blue. This is red, this is red. Because it's so obvious. But in instances where we say, oh, this is red, and tomorrow we say, oh, this is blue, and still the same person, like nothing has changed, just a change in days, and he says, no, this is blue, and tomorrow, okay, this is brown, then you realize the personal integrity is not there, the identity integrity is not there. So, and that's where conscience has a major role to play. We want to be able to do the internal exercise and as well ask ourselves, what is, I mean, my conscience, what we should be able to examine our conscience in relation to what is good as well as what is bad. And at all times, we should be able to see what is good for what it is and what is bad for what it is. Also, we have independent will. Independent will as well as a major role to play when it comes to building life purpose and in synchronizations to value-oriented personal identity. When you talk of independent will, you talk of one's ability to be able to choose, because God, the greatest one in the universe, actually gives each and every one of us the ability to use that free will, to use that independent will. And we want to try as much as we can to use it in a way that will contribute value to our life purpose. So the question you come to ask yourself is, how do you use your independent will? Let's take, for instance, a scenario whereby goodness needs to be exhibited, kindness needs to be exhibited, and there is two men within the space who has the opportunities, who has the liberty to exhibit, to utilize their independent will, and you realize that A chooses to be kind, B as well chooses not to be kind. No doubt about the fact that they both have independent will, but one chooses to withhold these, while the other one chooses to utilize these. So at every instance of time, we want to ask ourselves, how are we utilizing our independent will? Are we utilizing it to contribute to the good within the society, or am I utilizing, or am I withholding my independent will? One thing about the independent will is you can always utilize it to contribute not only to your life purpose or to contribute to a value-oriented identity for yourself, but you can as well utilize it to contribute positively to the society. That actually reminds me of something I found interesting in one of the books I read some time ago, and that's the success principle of this man who actually discovered the need to utilize his independent will to contribute to his society. The riverines within his areas was kind of dirty, and he actually see it as a kind of duty on himself to utilize his independent will to contribute to the society. And he took it upon himself to begin to clean up the riverines and get people around himself. He was able to build an organization around that project. And they're actually thriving and they are contributing to the society positively. That's a good example of how to utilize one's independence well. Don't be surprised that there are people as well who could have that opportunity to exhibit or utilize their independence well in a way that will contribute to their society, or they would choose to withhold it. Not only are they withholding it from themselves, but as well they're utilizing it to deprive themselves kind of something that would as well contribute positively to their identity. So you want to try as many as you can to utilize your independent well in a way that would contribute positively to your identity and as well help you in order to keep to keep sustaining success, not only on a short period, but as well over a long period of time. So now let's as well proceed and see what it requires, or things that are required when it comes to building a unique identity. So now let's talk about emotional or identity sabotage. Identity sabotage has a major role to play as well when it comes to building identity, your value-oriented identity. There are some certain things you want to watch out for, and these things will always help you when it comes to building your identity. Because when you neglect them or when you subject them to randomness, don't be surprised that these things could go as far as sabotaging one's identity. So you want to be on the watch out for those things. And that's where self-awareness comes into play. Identity sabotage could be in the form of emotions, and as well it could be in the form of action. So first you want to examine your emotions. You want to have a firm grip of your emotions. You want to know when you need to cut some certain things off, such a way that your emotions wouldn't be controlling you. That is, your emotions wouldn't subject you to identity which you really don't want. So you want to watch out for your identity. First, when there is any emotions, first you want to ask yourself what's actually triggering these emotions. What's causing these emotions? Then you want to go back to the root of what's actually causing that emotions and take it right away from there. Like I earlier mentioned, the example of these bracelets, it's mine, and I realized that in one way or the other, this is actually altering my identity one way or the other. I could observe that in my emotions and the way I felt, and I just okay, I have to pull this out. So you want to examine yourself at every instant and see how best you utilize your emotions as well to your advantage. Actions as well has a major role to play when it comes to building identity. It's often said action speaks louder than voice, and thus you want to give attention to actions at every instances and ensure that your actions are actually in sync with things which, with the identity which you're living with or you're living by. So it is your actions are in synchronization with your personal identity. Also, it is important that you examine your stimulus and give consideration to your liberty region. I call it liberty region because you have the opportunities to make choices right there. First, there are stimulus. It is in your these things you observe within yourself, which as well, it's feelings or more like things you observe, things you actually, I would say feelings because it's kind of as in things you sense within yourself and which in one way or the other would cause feelings as well as actions. So you want to see how best you utilize your liberty region in a way that would foster your identity towards your desired identity. For instance, when you talk of stimulus, when people do some certain things, no doubt about the fact that it could give you opportunities for you to feel to have one or two feelings. And you want to ensure that those feelings isn't something that would alter your identity. But rather, they are things that will help you to want to utilize your liberty region in a way that will contribute to your identity positively. Take, for instance, the two instances which I gave earlier on, of which we have someone in an office or three people in an office. We have more like the team lead, and we have two people who are kind of, one is temperamental, then the other person is always calm. And don't be surprised in one way or the other, the team lead might be exhibiting the same qualities towards them, expressing his views towards them. People generally might be expressing views towards these two people the same way. And thus they observe stimulus within themselves. And observing that stimulus, one is able to manage his emotions, his feelings, and thus act calmly, or the other one was able to, couldn't act calmly because he couldn't actually manage the emotions very well. So you want to ensure that you utilize your liberty regions very well. In this liberty region, it's a region which I would always suggest. Sometimes when you have these, you feel this emotional intensity, it is always important to take a pause and reflect, think inwardly, and see how best you could go around the situation. And that's why a good instance which a friend of mine, or my coach as well, whom I mentioned earlier, often suggests this. Sometimes before the day, it's always advisable that you think through your actions. You could have imagined expectations of things that would come up right during the day and see how best you could mitigate it. And that would actually help you. And if you can't do that, when there are situations that are kind of tense, and you realize you have an identity at stake, it is always important to take a pause, to just reflect a little bit on how best you can respond to such situations and just keep making progress in responding in a way that will foster your identity positively. But in instances whereby you don't examine or you don't utilize your liberty region, when there are issues, you really don't put into consideration this liberty region and the importance of taking advantage of this liberty region, then in one way or the other, your actions might actually alter your identity, and which you really don't want to engage in. And now let's talk about your actual self as well as your desired self. In building a unique identity, no doubt either knowingly or unknowingly, as at this moment, you have an identity. Either it's unique, it's value-oriented, or not value-oriented, it's another thing. But as it is now, you have an identity. Don't you want to ask yourself, who am I at the moment? If one is having challenges in identifying who he or she is at the moment, then you want to ask yourself or ask your friends, those who live with you, those who are your associates, to describe who you have and tell you any areas of life which they felt you actually having a displeasing attribute or a displeasing personality or a displeasing character. Then you want to examine those things and see if it's something you would want to be associated with. And if it's not something you want to be associated with, then it's time to examine how best you carve out a unique unique identity for yourself. And that's where filling the gap comes in. Here is the actual self now at the moment, and here is your desired self. So what you want to do is you want to fill in this gap, and that's what I refer to as humiliating gap. That is, it's humiliating in the sense that we don't know that this is actually the identity we are projecting, and we don't know this is actually what we want because we've not taken time to examine what we want in relation to what we actually exhibited. That's why I said of instances in which some people at big late in their life, in their 50s, in their 60s, they will tell you that when they look back, they would have done something differently. And in one way or the other, they couldn't go back and actually turn things around. But now, we have the opportunities to examine our identity. We want to build a unique identity. We want to build identities tailored towards what we actually wanted in life. And thus realize that we are building something we should want in such a way that when someone should actually place a dictionary sort of and put, or these are our imaginary board, and put your name, identity that will be displayed will be something you are pleasant about, something that's actually valuable to you, something you're proud of, and something that is actually contributing to your value positively. And something you won't be like, oh, that will put a smile on your face. You say, wow, this actually speaks good of me. But not something that, I mean, you just do research of your name, more like imaginarily, and you're like, oh, I mean, this isn't what I want out of life. So it's always important to see how best you can carve out a unique, value-oriented personal identity for yourself, and as well see how best you fill in the humiliating gap, that is, those things that you know are lacking. You want to do your self-examinations, you want to ask people for feedback, and as well, you want to utilize those feedback in a way that will project you towards your desired identity in any categories of life. And lastly, we want to talk about briefly about validations. In as much as validations is important, don't be surprised that seeking validation, internal validation is always very important. And when there is no direct identity built inwardly, then internal validation might actually goes wrong, because in one way or the other, there are instances in which people satisfy their feelings, and those feelings aren't based on integrity, aren't based on their desires of identity. So you want to ensure that before you talk of having this internal validation, you want to ensure you actually build a unique internal identity. And external validation as well is as well important, but you want to make sure that it is important you don't build your life, or don't build an identity from external to the internal. Because when you build from the external to the internal, then it's kind of, it wouldn't be more of a value-oriented as much as it is of non-value-oriented personal identity. So you want to ensure that any form of external validations is in congruence with your internal validations, is in congruence with your internal identity. And yeah, with that, you won't be able to achieve your objective of building a unique value-oriented personal identity. So I hope you find this short course very interesting, and thank you for the time, and thank you for the opportunities to share these knowledge things, these information as well with you. So have a great day.